Okay, hello, and welcome to Print Politics. My name is Stephanie Sadarafai, and on behalf of Compact, the SVA, Department of Anthropology, and Taft Research Center at the University of Cincinnati, I'm so pleased to welcome both the presenters today and all of you in attendance. Before I do that, I want to formally introduce Compact and the people behind it to everybody, because it is a new initiative of the Society for Visual Anthropology that was founded just this year. So Compact stands for the Collective for Multimodal Makers, Publishers, Collaborators, and Teachers. It was founded by Nat Nazverdrani, Gabriela Zamorano, and myself. We're committed to creating spaces to discuss less visible elements of making, publishing, collaborating, and teaching both visual and multimodal anthropologies. We plan to collect shared wisdom and experiences in triannual online curated repositories, and to have virtual events like this that both continue these kinds of conversations and activate other arms of the SVA, like the Visual Research Conference, Visual Anthropology Review, the flagship journal of the SVA, as well as the AAA conference program this year hosted in association with CASCA. You can find out more about Compact, including how to get involved. We are but 3 people, but welcome for more people to get in touch with us by visiting the SVA website. And Nat, if you could drop that link in the chat, that would be great. Today, we are so thrilled to welcome both Mark Fisher and Anne Pasek to discuss their work and projects. Mark is a Chicago-based artist and member of Temporary Services, a group that has produced over 100 publications and organized and participated in dozens of exhibitions, projects, and events. Fisher and Brett Bloom of Temporary Services also run the publishing imprint, Half Letter Press, which I cannot recommend highly enough. And if we could also drop a link of that in the chat so people could follow along. Anne is an interdisciplinary researcher working at the intersections of climate communication, the environmental humanities, and science and technology studies. She studies how carbon becomes communicable in different communities and media forms to different political and material effects. Anne and Mark will be in conversation with both myself and Craig Campbell from UT Austin. They will first each give a 10-minute presentation about their work. Craig and I will pose 3 questions and lead discussion for about a half an hour, and then we'll use the final half hour to answer your questions that you might have in the chat. For your questions, please actually use the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom of your screen. This will let other people see your questions, upvote them, add comments to them so that we don't get a lot of the same questions. And Nat will be monitoring those and raising those to the panelists in that last 30 minutes. We want to say that the chat is also available. You can chat to the entire group, to the organizers, to the panelists, to the hosts. And we've also enabled automatically generated captions and a live transcript of the event, which may contain errors just based on the sound quality of the mic and other background noises. Final thing, we are recording this and we will post edited, tightened version of it to the Compact website in November, along with the curated resources. In your emails, you should have also gotten the call for participation. So we are looking for pitches for those online curated resources. And we encourage you to submit. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Mark, who will start us off. And thank you.
Thank you so much. This is such a treat. I don't visit too many anthropology departments projects, so this is really great. I'm going to set a timer real quick so that I try to stay on task here. Okay, and I'm going to share screen as well. Hopefully everyone can see this. So I'm going to talk just very briefly with Brett Bloom and others in the past. I'm part of the group Temporary Services, artist group that started in Chicago. We're now split between Chicago and Fort Wayne, Indiana. In 2008, we started a publishing imprint, Half Letter Press, named for a letter-sized sheet of paper folded in half rather than letter set letterpress printing. Um, excuse me, real quick. We make art collaboratively. We work outside of the commercial gallery system. We create exhibitions, projects, publications together and with others. And we've published over 120 books, booklets, posters, and newspapers. For us, a publication can be, as modest as a piece of paper folded in half to something more like a 200-page book. I'm going to give a very quick slideshow of just some range of some of the things we've done. Our publication started more like exhibition guides, and then gradually we started making more standalone publications that functioned without accompanying projects and exhibits. Photocopying, digital printing, offset printing, occasionally newspapers. At first, maybe we made 150 copies of the things we do. We've made newspapers that have a print run of 20,000 copies, books that have a print run of a couple thousand copies. We distribute our own work. We work with stores. We present our work at book fairs. Basically, all of the ways that artists' books can go out into the world, except we avoid Amazon completely. So in 2007, I started this project, Public Collectors, which was basically created to encourage, I guess, what you would call like sort of amateur experts to share their resources outside of an institutional setting. There's this term the artist Claire Pentecost uses that I really like a lot, of public amateurs. So these people who are, really trying to figure out, deal with certain problems in a kind of public setting as artists. And in 2010, I was visiting Kansas City to give a lecture, and a young artist there, Sean Starowitz, reached out to me and wanted to offer me a burnt ends residency. I'm like, what is this? What this consisted of was him taking an out of town artist out to lunch for barbecue and showing them around the city, and he called that a residency, and it lasted like half of an afternoon, and it was. I'm like the worst person to take to barbecue because I don't eat red meat, so I just had this enormous like coma-inducing turkey sandwich that was like 7 inches tall. But this idea really stuck with me, and in 2016 I decided to create the Jungbu Artist Residency, which consisted solely of me bringing out of town artists to have buying them lunch at Jungbu Market in my neighborhood in Chicago, which is Avondale, and it's this Korean market, Asian market that has a Korean lunch snack stand in the back, and it's very inexpensive, so it's not the kind of place where someone would feel guilty that you bought them lunch there. Most people would just go and like spend 3 times as much buying snacks and gifts for their friends in the rest of the market after the residency. But it became a way of really making time for others outside of something like, a studio visit at a college or a meeting with someone where you're their advisor, but just basically being available to other artists to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. And some people had very specific creative things they were working on that they wanted feedback on, and other people just wanted to have a free-flowing, formless conversation. And I would make like a little report um, at the end for the social media accounts of Public Collectors at the end of the event. And then I published this booklet, the Meal-Based Artist Residency Program, which talks about the ideas of the project and just gives an overview of what the kinds of people who participated, what their work is, and what we discussed. So these are some of the past residents proudly displaying their finished or mostly finished meals. Um, So while this was happening toward the end, I did this 38 times in 2 years. I would host up to two people a month. While this was happening, as is always the case in Chicago, there were many protests around police murdering civilians. And I attended these protests, participated in these protests, was involved in activism around this. And at some point while this was happening, this was especially centered around the case of former police officer Jason Van Dyke, who murdered a black youth, Laquan McDonald, shooting him 16 times. And at some point, they began pretrial hearings for Jason Van Dyke at this building, which is criminal court on 26th in California. I'd been in this building a couple times as a prospective juror on criminal cases. I do not get picked for jury duty once questioned. It seems to be like a talent I have. But I was always very interested in that process. Went to some of the pretrial hearings, and on one of those days, um, the court met, someone needed more paperwork, something went back to discovery, and everything was finished in 5 minutes, and the court went into recess until the next day. So I was like, well, like, okay, like I'm already here, I'm already in the building, like what else is there to do? And there are about 25 courtrooms in this building, so I started visiting some of the other ones. While I was in court for Jason Van Dyke's pretrial hearing, there were other activists or other people who were interested in this specific case that I could talk to and who were really knowledgeable and had a lot of insights. Once I left that situation, I quickly found that the only people really witnessing what was happening in court are people who either had a case or family members or maybe family of victims. Um, and that was it. There are very few people observing otherwise, if anyone. And it occurred to me, like in that moment, that maybe I was kind of getting tired of Jungbu, not their food, but just that project. That maybe I should shift this to something more complicated and start a residency where I observe court with other artists. You cannot take photos in court, so the photos are usually of the food we ate at the taqueria down the street, and people's notebooks. Um, the taqueria is where we eat. We eat the same taqueria every time because it's kind of where like court and the outside world collide. Like if you'll see people in court or like security guards, lawyers, defendants who are out on bond. All of those people are hungry and will go to this taqueria after they're done in that building. So this project turned into a publication series, and each publication consists of 4 conversations with the different artist residents about what we observed in court. Typically, we would observe a morning session, lasting about 3 hours. In some cases, we would spend the entire day in court, depending on what happened. And then every 4 residencies, there would be a new booklet. These are about 36 pages long. They cost $7 or $8 each. They're printed on a risograph duplicator as well as offset printed. This is a photo from Jason Van Dyke's sentencing hearing. You can sort of see me in the back, and then to my side is the artist Josh Rios. There's all this extra security in the courtroom. Photos from the neighborhood or outside around the court because of not being able to photograph inside. The third and then 4th issue of the booklet. And this continued for 16 residencies, 4 booklets, and on the last day of the project was basically the first day that everything shut down because of COVID. I was actually about to go to court that day, and it was clear that that was not something we could or should do, and the resident had to cancel at the last minute. And I've not picked up the project since. but that was the basic structure of the project. The other thing that happened was that I would donate $20, which is the approximate cost of lunch for two people at Taqueria El Milagro. I would make that donation to the community bond fund every time I conducted a residency. So the project kind of hit a stopping point. My talk should hit a stopping point, but that's the basics of that publication series. And hopefully people will think about this, not just as like a project about court, but a structure that could be used for all sorts of purposes. That really it's a commitment to spending time with others in your field or some other field that you want to participate in, and creating this like concrete material object that serves as a public record of what was discussed in the way that a journal or book or anything else might. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to remind everybody, go ahead and start putting your questions in the Q&A button so you don't forget. But now we're going to turn to Anne.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was really, really exciting. I'm thrilled to see where the conversation goes. I will kick things off in the typical Canadian way with a land acknowledgement. My name's Anne Pasek, and I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 20 territory in Canada, the traditional homelands of the Mississauga Anishinaabeg. I'll also flag that I'm not speaking entirely alone. All the thoughts that I'm going to share today have very much come out of extensive collaborations with the Low Carbon Research Methods group. And the aim of this group is to think about how the methods by which we produce, but also distribute and share our research are tied up simultaneously in environmental, social, and epistemological outcomes, like always all three together. And so if, like me, you're sort of professionally anxious about climate change and wants to sort of bring those concerns into your research practice, it's incumbent to also think about how that connects to larger projects of building an academy that's like more welcoming to live and work in, and that can think different kinds of thoughts. So the idea behind this research group has a story, and I thought I'd just start here by telling it. So this is becoming less and less true as time passes, but I still feel like I'm a relatively recent doctor. I finished my PhD in 2019. And that project was all about the kind of communicative and aesthetic challenges of making carbon into an object of politics in the past 30 years of climate diplomacy and debate. And part of that is thinking really critically about carbon footprinting practices. They happen to be enmeshed with oil company PR efforts and, often bring us to kind of rather thin political ends. So I wrote, some pretty critical chapters on this, but didn't want to kind of leave things with me just writing, mead words on a page and moving on with my life. I thought I should, be a little self-reflexive, try and practice or experience what I'm thinking about with my interlocutors. So I had enough skills that I could do a really crappy carbon accounting job. And so at the end of the dissertation, there's this appendix where I try and apply these techniques to see what different parts of writing this document sort of rounded out to in terms of carbon climate impacts. And I was really surprised by the results. As you can see from my very exciting Microsoft Excel chart here, overwhelmingly, the vast majority of my emissions, some 94%, is airplanes, right? Like books or digital data transfer, not even close. And what's more, the sort of sum of these emissions from air travel were about the same as the sum of my carbon footprint of just living my life as a broke student in New York for a whole year. So this told me that there was something happening with the kinds of institutional travel funding I had access to, and the kind of research norms that, encouraged me to travel so often, all that sort of really went against my self-image as an urban climate lefty, leading a version of the low carbon good life. The other thing this told me was that when we're talking about the work of research, right, the what and the how of method, we're also really talking about mobility, about like kinds of travel, ways of being in the world physically and moving through it, that stand behind and inflect how we produce and exchange knowledge. So questions of method to me, I think are just significantly and always going to be questions of mobility. And it's clear that some forms of research do more climate harms than others. And so that provoked me to think about, what might it mean to make a rough distinction and say like high carbon research looks like this, low carbon research looks like that. And where does that kind of square out across all kinds of different projects, different research subjects, different disciplines? And how could this sort of culminate in a discussion about method as a means to sort of build some collective gains for the project of research and the livability of being a researcher? And I'm by no means like unique in this thinking. There's many initiatives across the world thinking about the role that flying plays in professional lives and in the climate system. No Fly CliSci is a bunch of climate scientists who have gotten together, disavowed air travel, and now take rather heroic train trips to get to various summits. There's also a petition called Flying Less, which is open to any academic who would like to sort of make a vow and join this collectivity. More close to perhaps the disciplinary center in this room, Hannah Knox has really provocatively talked about not flying as a kind of formative pillar of post-carbon anthropology, whatever that might mean. It's an interesting provocation. And you survey all these efforts, you find a range of different claims, qualitative, quantitative, normative. There's all sorts of people out there doing all sorts of things. But the sort of major contribution that I wanted to make was to think about how this is, again, like a more than just environmental question. And I think that there's a way that we could do that by looking with some curiosity at how we exist in a culture of academic highs and lows of norms, of structuring habits and opinions that kind of really do inflect the ways in which mobility and carbon kind of congeal across the academy. And so, I think a lot about air travel as a kind of conspicuous consumption, right? There's pleasures in that, also forms of social recognition and status, right? Especially if someone else is flying you somewhere, or you've just got like heaps and heaps of research funding. So like you can be the person who can afford to go to like absolutely all the conferences in all of your fields. And that status is more than symbolic, right? It's an actual field in my tenure file. It sort of works as evidence that I am influential and good at my job, right? So it's not something I think to be easily dismissed. But at the same time, it's also a metric of achievement that clearly isn't available equally to everyone, right? We could think about folks who have visa restrictions or like difficult passports, people who simply don't have the money for all these hotels and flights, folks who have care work obligations at home that make travel really, really difficult, people with disabilities for whom travel is extra risky, periods of pandemic and plague, right, where that also factors out. The list can really go on, but it's clear that not everyone can equally become this sort of jet-fueled knowledge subject. And more to this end, we could also think about the ways that like air travel makes certain kinds of research practice possible. Things like helicopter or parachute research, this idea of, going into a place, grabbing something, getting out. I know that you folks in anthropology have spent a great deal of time thinking through this all, and I've probably got a lot to learn from you. My point here isn't that, getting on a plane inevitably equals extractive research, but I'm interested in thinking about how that plane seems to be kind of structurally integral to a lot of the ways that this works out, right? And how mobility and energy seem to be really key and unexamined parts of the kinds of harms that can happen in the academy today. And so this sort of brings me to the question of media and mediated ways of producing and sharing knowledge to sort of displace or offer an alternative to the assumption that we always need to do so in person. Usually the default here is that like we all just need to put things online, make everything digital. And the pandemic was a kind of revolutionary, if very poorly designed way of trying that out, right? I think we all learned that we had more capacities than we thought, but we also all got really, really tired, right? Having a lot of bad time on Zoom. And like there's a bunch of really interesting people thinking about how we could design digital exchanges better. What might it mean to have like a good coffee break in a virtual conference, I think, is a question that therefore has a lot of stakes. But we are here to talk about print, so I wanted to lay out just a few claims. So firstly, I think that print is a really important alternative to airplanes, right? When we think about what it might mean to no longer take as read or easily available the idea of easy travel, we might look to the past and think about how academic communities formed through the post, right? This sort of like idea of a return to the Republic of Letters is really interesting to me. We might also think about a kind of alternative hedonism, right? So like, what might it mean to prioritize things that are genuinely enjoyable and good when we reshuffle our lives in the midst of a larger energy and climate transition? Maybe there's ways of bringing people along on an environmental and equity journey where we convince them that it's not just a question of what they need to give up, but also what they could gain, right? What would be genuinely good in a world that we could make. And then finally, to come back to the question of experimental methods, I'm really interested in thinking about what new thoughts and forms of collaboration might be possible if we were all just a little more intentional about the media that we use to do research, right? Or even research dissemination, what does it mean to kind of attack and dethrone the PowerPoint as the default and to have to think a little more critically and creatively about how we do what we do and what the right tools might be? So my biggest example of how this all lands and what I'll focus on for the rest of my talk here is DIY Methods, which is a conference conducted through the mail via zine. We're entering into our second year this year. Last year was our first. The way that it works is that we solicited pitches from researchers all over the world and all over the academy who wanted to share something about their experimental research methods. They designed zines. Some printed their own, some just sent us a file to print. We had a kind of action center where everything got collected and then compiled into these exciting orange envelopes. We then mailed them out to everyone who contributed. So if you gave us a zine, we gave you 1 kilogram of zines back in the mail after a couple of months. We also digitized the whole proceedings, which is hosted on HCommons. So that meant that like participants effectively got a DOI and a line on their CV. So, it counts as real research, and we can talk more about how we can creatively navigate these sort of like institutional systems of prestige and gatekeeping. Doing this also meant that we could, invite people into the conference who hadn't contributed a zine, right? Like folks can just be attendees in the room, as it were. And it also meant that we got a kind of second shot at accessibility, because we could have sort of screen reader friendly versions of zines. They could be both like visually elegant and doing wonderful, interesting things for the eye, and then also, rendered in a different form, available for different modes of consumption. And the results were really, really interesting. People, I think, responded to the prompt, cued in by some maybe like remembered or experienced or imagined 90s DIY zine ethoses. So this often meant being quite literal and like producing a guide that would teach the reader how to do something themselves, and how in that spirit to sort of modify and invent it with the aim of a kind of like tacit empowered reader being the goal. So for example, this is Peter Wojcik's zine about public history in Kentucky, examining sort of interesting and hidden racial histories of the horse racing industry in a neighborhood that's rapidly gentrifying. And it came in two parts. The first was his production of the zine. The second was a blank. So it has all of these prompts and sort of walks the reader through how they can practice this particular methodological orientation where they live and where they work. Another highlight for me is a zine called Play as a Mode of Research. So Jean Hunleth and Sienna Runes made a zine about how they did work on children's health outcomes during the pandemic. So how do you remotely collaborate with children as research subjects? And part of their answer was to make these cartoon characters of both themselves and the kids. And, using a character was a way of kind of getting in front of anonymity concerns when you're working with minors. But it was also a way to sort of situate the researcher on more reciprocal grounds with the research subject. And their zine begins by bringing you into that process. So like, here's my goofy cartoon character Yarnball, ready to go do anonymized research about rural health outcomes. We also had some folks who were, zine seasoned experts, like Izzy Hayes, who wrote a zine about Riot Girl zines. And I really love their work because it includes all these really interesting kind of like director's commentary pop-out texts about, feelings of ambivalence or enthusiasm about what is otherwise the straightforward content of the zine. And, it's lovely. There's a complaint form in the back explicitly soliciting readerly feedback. So there's a way in which, opening the door to new modes and methods of soliciting research means that you have different sort of readerly experiences and forms of exchange made possible by reading, which was just really, really exciting. Others took the opportunity to think about the way that the materiality of print really matters. So Jessica Marion Barr's zine was made using newspaper flyers and included also a block of handmade paper that had been crafted from a local invasive weed, dog strangling vine. And so the sort of part of that project was thinking about the consonances between like invasive species in our ecological environments and invasive species in our sort of media environments, and how we could sort of work to make those both into gifts rather than pests. So yeah, it was amazing. And we wanted to kind of capture our experiences of running this sort of unconventional conference and then figure out both practically and then also in more abstract terms, like theoretically, what we were experiencing through the whole thing. We've got a white paper out. I'll drop a link in the chat later. But a real like underscored kind of delightful discovery of the whole thing was really finding out that like pleasure and conviviality were qualities of print that mattered, right? Being able to attend a conference, in a reading chair at your own pace, away from a screen, seemed just to be broadly good and appreciated by everyone. No bad PowerPoint slides menaced anyone. There was no one reading a sort of overly wordy and hasty prepared bit of theory. It was just genuinely nice. And so again, I'm really holding on to both the kind of like strategic and like theoretical ties that come from a kind of politics of pleasure and how that matters for print, because I think both of these things are important. If you want to be notified when DIY Methods 23's proceedings go online, you can find a little button at the bottom of our website on which to do so. Please do feel free, and we'll also ping you when the CFP goes out for 2024, because we're going to keep this ball running as long as I've got the funding for it, because it's just too much fun. I think I'm going to leave it here. I've also got more to say about personal practices of zine making and the like, but maybe that'll come out in the comments, maybe that'll come out in questions. Yeah, I'm just really delighted to chat with you all, because it's good to be among print geeks. We are of a certain sort.
Thank you both. Okay, so now we're entering the phase where Craig and I are going to pose a few questions for discussion. Please do post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to those in about 30 minutes. So Craig, why don't you go ahead and start?
Great. Thanks very much, Stephanie and Anne and Mark. Thanks so much for your introductions. Hopefully we can, in this conversation, really build on the foundations you've established. So the first question is this, Anne, on your website, you write that sometimes the best way to think through questions is by making art for machines, end quote. Can both of you talk, please, about how designing for print might also help you think through different questions and questions differently? Or put another way, what do you find particularly generative about working in print? What does it mean to have a print practice? And what does it mean to be a publisher? And for all of those in the audience, we gave them these questions in advance. So if you're having trouble following that question, fortunately, they've had a chance to think a little bit about it. So did we decide who was going to go first? I can't remember. Okay, I'll open it up then. Either one of you go ahead, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Sure, I'll take a stab at a part of an answer, and then Mark, you can round things out and expand, because I'm sure I won't get it all. Yeah, I think I'll go back to what I said about, you know, the sort of materiality of the object being important. In both a kind of general like research creation, arts-based practice sort of ethos, right? Like I think that we are all very indebted to the tools that we use to think, and sort of taking a design-based approach encourages a little bit of more self-reflexivity about that, rather than just, you know, assuming that an 8,000 word article is the best and only way to shape a thought. I think that also cashes out in being considerate of like the audience that you're trying to speak to, and what the best way to speak to them might be. In some of my other zine practices, I really appreciate the way it forces me to write in a register that is human and legible. It means that I can, like, you know, share things with my family. It means that I can, you know, leave things in public places and know that they have a good shot of sort of being understood and therefore impactful. Yeah, I had a little project once where when I was back in Alberta, my hometown, and also the sort of oil city major in Canada, I made a little zine about like my complicated petroleum feelings of being back in my hometown and sort of seeing it differently. And I wanted to sort of like find a way to like bring my fellow Edmontonians, many of whom are quite resistant to thinking about climate change, into some of those complexities. And the best way that I could think of was just to make a lot of drawings, because it's a sort of visual lure that will encourage people to pick up stuff, and then compose those into a zine, and then just like hit all of the free libraries and bus stops that I could find in walking distance and just let them float. Or alternatively, like, because everyone in Alberta has someone who works in the oil sector, doing a kind of like reverse sampling thing where I give zines to people to give to people that they know that work in the sector to give to their friends. And I just, you know, it's a common enough kind of book culture thought, but you don't know where these kind of promiscuous objects will end up. And I think that is a really, really useful thing to keep in mind when I'm forming my thoughts and trying to put them out there, because you want to sort of make knowledge that will be a good guest, I guess, wherever it lands. And that, I think, has a kind of interesting ethos of care built into it. I've been talking too much. What do you think, Mark?
These are such great answers, and I love that presentation. I think, you know, I mean, in terms of like bringing artists to criminal court and spending a few hours there with them, and then so we would, you know, we would record this conversation we would have about what we experienced, transcribe it, go back and forth, editing the transcription. Sometimes people would want to write something additional. I think, you know, knowing that what you say is going to become a publication, I don't think it was inhibiting for people, but it certainly does like nudge people in a direction of maybe speaking in a more precise way, or maybe making more careful or thoughtful choices about what struck them about the things we saw that they wanted to talk about. Um, the parameters having like this, not having this kind of the sky's the limit approach that you sometimes find on audio blogs where people will just talk for an hour and a half and like it's like for these booklets, I mean, it's like you've got like 8 pages or including images in some cases for us to unpack what we saw in 3 hours, which could have included, we could have seen like 30 cases get processed by a judge in 5 different courtrooms, or we could have just stayed with one case, or we could have watched with one person, all we did was watch jury selection for about 3 hours. And so, that became what we talked about. But I think, yeah, I think like, it becomes a different, it sort of sets a particular tone for the nature of the collaboration, and that, that people are, going to be like, they're sort of making their experience public and being accountable, for how they uh, talk about what we experienced, which we there's no, I mean, anyone can do what we did without making a publication, but I think that there is like a kind of commitment to thought and language that printing 500 copies of something that moves around the world and ends up in libraries and lives in people's homes and goes to people's classrooms and all these different places that print goes. And I mean, there were at one point I was also leaving these publications in like free newspaper boxes and little free libraries because I realized, I do think like they are about, experiences and material and subject matter that like should be available and relevant and is comprehensible to people who live in Chicago and know that we have a court system. So preparing, for how you, publish to those kinds of unknowable audiences, I think is also that's in the background too, definitely.
It's so interesting to hear you two approach this, that Mark, on the one hand, the artist would be more precise and careful, and Anne on your side, coming from the more academic, that it's like, oh, you can be like actually human and like not have all the inhibitions about speaking to your peers or to the discipline or whatever. But that print is it's capacious enough to hold both of those in tension. I just found that really striking in your responses.
I think part of the care is also like you're sort of, it's like when you're in court, you're watching people experiencing possibly the worst thing that's happened to them in their life, right? So it's also like, it's not that like the conversations aren't lively, like they're very lively, but like we're also watching people's lives get like tossed around, in that system. So I think, that's maybe why I'm talking about it in that way. But yeah.
Good. Do we want to jump to the next question, or
yeah, you go ahead. I have another follow-up too.
Okay. Well, if your follow-up's like directly follow-up, then mine takes it off on a little bit of a different path.
So, well, okay. So my question was about what does it mean to be a publisher piece of it? Because both of you are not just putting your own work out, but you're also gathering together. And Mark, obviously not just through these projects, but through other work. I'm thinking about somebody in the chat mentioned the Quarantine, the 11 by 17, like all of that. What does it mean, or how do you relate to bringing other people's work to print, or designing texts or modifying it and making it be part of this, the way that you phrased it, Mark, this public record?
Yeah, I mean, you're basically, you're in part being like a caretaker for other people's work and ideas, and which is like a many years long process of either selling things through a web store or bringing them to stores or bringing them to book fairs or including them when there are exhibitions that include my work. Like that becomes another platform for giving visibility to the work of other people. so yeah, so I think, I mean, to me, like being a publisher is it's like you're caring for like every aspect of the process, from like the printing itself in many cases, or like taking things to the post office, and finding a home for, and taking this kind of responsibility for the things you've made yourself or with other people. And uh I mean, the worst thing in the world would be like to waste all of these resources making publications and then they just like nothing happens with them. They don't go anywhere, they're not read by anyone. So like that, being guiding them like into the world so that they have some kind of life, that's um a big part of this. And
Yeah.
being, and then like the author and the artist and the designer and the printer like can do all of these things. You're not just sort of like there are people who pass their entire print run over to some distributor who does this, and they have almost no interaction with their readers and their audience. And to me, that would be dissatisfying. Like I enjoy every part of this process, even though it is very time consuming and labor intensive. Like that labor and that time is all part of the creative work.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you say about how it seems like you wear many different hats, right? You're never just a publisher when you are a publisher.
I mean, today we're like lecturers.
Yeah,
Yeah, panelists.
yeah, and like, so there's like relational skills that happen there, right? Like trying to support people who are kind of stuck, or talk people gently away from an outcome that might be overly complicated and have a sort of bad materialization. There's also a kind of like editorial like level. So for DIY Methods, it's a sort of juried conference. So we will jury pitches and then need to sort of consider, here's the substance of my intellectual idea, and here's my plan for how I would sort of instantiate it in something. And both of those things matter, and can both sort of like benefit from kind of productive feedback. So I guess like to be a publisher is to be a collaborator in a very expansive sense. And that has its own rewards and struggles, as does all part of academic work. But yeah, it's worth, I think, thinking critically about and practicing, right? Just like I hope we all get a chance to be on either side of that like peer review publication machine. It's rewarding to do the same with print.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so I've got a bit of a follow-up, and I guess it's kind of an elaboration. It seems to me, for me anyway, over the past few years, I've noticed how design has really been captured as a term to mean lots of different things, kind of like curation did a while back. And in that, it's kind of shadowed layout and the sort of technical practices of layout, which really get treated as being like just technical, right? And so one of the things that interests me about you both in your work is, how does layout teach you, and how does layout lead you to think in different ways? And again, that's a very, very big question, I know, but it's something that really fascinates me, and I think we don't really talk enough about that, because it just gets treated as like just a technical thing, right?
I have a short answer, in part because I'm like, I don't know if I do a well enough job on this front. But if you have the kind of process where you have a very, very rough draft that's just text that you're then sort of bringing into however you design, whether that's cut and paste or whether that's a sort of publisher program, and you're really kind of like finishing those ideas with layout in mind, I think it can be really effective, because layout is a way of kind of pacing the span of a thought, right? And some thoughts deserve to be sort of small and held with a lot of space. Others, should flow from one to the next. So That is to say, excellent layout is sort of excellent cognitive design, and is to me kind of intimately tied into the formal and conceptual work the pros should be doing.
Right.
Sometimes that's an aspiration, though. How do you land that plane, Mark?
I mean, I have the most unfussy, pragmatic approach to designing everything. And a lot of it has to do with budget and resources and not feeling like text needs to be this multicolor 35 font extravaganza. I mean, legal size paper is a standard format. It's also just kind of hilarious to me that a publication about what happens in courtrooms would be on legal format paper. But it's like it works really nicely for 2 columns per page. My wife always makes the critique that I don't leave enough room for people's like fingers on the margins, that I'm ungenerous in this way. But yeah, I mean for me it's like I'm publishing conversations in this case, and they should flow clearly in a clear visual way. And I think with public collectors, with the way I design things in general, it's like I really try to keep the focus on the content is generally other people's writings, thoughts, images, and I try to create like the least fussy layouts that don't distract away from that honor what people are trying to say without trying to make them excited about this visually crazy layout or something. If
Great,
I
thanks.
wonder, oh, sorry. I
No,
wonder
it's-
too if like the multiple hat wearing that as publishers we're also collaborators, also is where there is such a sharp divide, I feel, between the kinds of projects that y'all are doing and the kinds of work that anthropologists on this call might be imagining for themselves, given the industrial landscape of academic publishing, right? So I know that Fiona McDonald is on this webinar. We co-edited Visual Anthropology Review. We launched a beautiful redesign that's now all going into the garbage can because Wiley wants to mainstream stuff, and it's making impossible for them. We're on the editorial board now, for VAR to be able to publish work that considers layout, that considers how the image and text and the pacing and all of that work together, often using the language of making it more accessible, making it work across platforms, making it work that print is dead, digital's the future, that this needs to be always available. And on the Low Carbon Research Methods website, I love that while y'all digitize things and things are available, if the sun is not out and the Raspberry Pi that is powering the website doesn't have power, it's offline. And like that sense that it can be accessible without being constantly sucking resources. So I want to pivot from that observation to actually our third question, because I'm mindful of the time and I think we've already talked a little bit about circulation. So Anne and Mark, both of your practices and projects are rooted in generosity, which Craig and I really appreciate. Can you talk more about, and you've already spoken a little bit about this, but how does that shape your approach to editing, designing, organizing, publishing, and the like? What lessons about making and collaborating do you feel others could learn from this work?
I mean, basically, when you're making publication, I mean, you're making time like for other people. Like I mean, to me, like it's like in order to make these booklets, I have to spend time with people. I have to email back and forth with them. And the questions Tamara brought up, this project Quarantine, which was during the first 3 months of the pandemic, every day I made a new double-sided piece of paper format publication, and about 75 out of 100 of those issues that I made were collaborations with other people. And during that time, when everyone was so freaked out for a million reasons, that spending those 5 or 6 hours maybe working back and forth over email, never in person with collaborators was, this amazingly positive, holistic thing. It was this incredible experience of sharing this like digital emotional space with other people, and with like zero regard for whether it would be like commercially, you know, successful or profitable in some way. It actually wound up like sustaining itself extremely well, and being profitable because so many people wanted to support it. But yeah, it's really, I mean, it's really about like, and then with like spending time with people in court, I mean, you experience like, horrible, you hear like terrible things. And so doing that with another person is also like sharing the weight of that, and caring for each other, that like, we just watched something terrible happen to this person, or heard about something terrible that was done to another person. So yeah, I mean, like that being together with a person, in the making of the work, is, I mean, that's an important part of that whole process for me, and those collaborations.
Yeah, those are all really good answers. Mine, I think, are going to be a little bit less magnificent and maybe askew, but I want to sort of underline what you said because I think that's really good. My first answer is really unsentimental. It's just that part of the reason why I could do this project was that I got a very fancy research chair job, which sort of gives me quite a lot of walking around money. And instead of spending that on conferences, like flying me there, I thought it would be interesting to spend it in a way that could, build a network, could bring some of that positive politics of pleasure forward, and sort of Robin Hood those resources around. So I think if anyone who finds themselves so advantaged may also find it rewarding to give stuff away. One of the nice things is that, DIY Methods is very, very free. No one pays to be a part of it. And I just get to, cover the printing and shipping costs. And this is how I'm sabotaging the Canadian government. It's quite nice. The second thought that I had follows from that, but with a little bit more sentimentality, which is that I think that there really is a way of approaching research as a gift economy. And like, Stephanie, I think this lands a lot with your zine about hospitality as research. But for us and Sarah Rayner, a grad student that I worked quite closely on this project with, like it seems endemic to zine culture in general, right? Like you put so much of yourself into creating something that you sell for very, very little, or you just give away. And I think that's a really beautiful ethos to sort of bring back to academia, right? Like, in effect, that's what we do with peer review publications. It just feels kind of joyless at the end. And if you don't have an institutional library subscription, it's not free for you, for sure. So, if we are expending so much effort with a kind of brought hope that it will find someone that it might be useful for, and knowing that use will never be easy to align with all the effort that goes into getting there, might as well just wear our hearts on our sleeves, I think. Yeah.
You got sentimental there. That was great. You tried for the unsentimental, but yeah, let's wear our hearts on our sleeves. It's lovely. Stephanie, do we want to move to questions now from the audience? What do we want to do?
Sure. Yeah. It looks like we have a question in the Q&A box from Florian. Do you want to read that one, Craig?
Can
you see it?
No, I'm not sure. I can see.
Sure. Oh, okay, I can see it.
I got it. Okay. Okay. So Florian says, "Thank you very much, Mark and Anne, for your great presentations, and your zines projects reminds me of the networked character of correspondence art and mail art. And I think it is a wonderful way to bring researchers, artists, and print geeks," loved that expression, "together. I was wondering how the zines, but also Mark's collaborative publications resonate back with the interlocutors, to people in court, to families, etc.
Well, one of the interesting things that happened during the courtroom residency, so it's very interesting to be in that space, you know, not as an employee of the court, not as someone with a case, not as a prospective juror, just to be there to bear witness to that process. But you know, in doing that, you're surrounded by a family of people who are tied up in this process. And there was one situation that I observed with people multiple times was hearings for a man, Gerald Reed, who was tortured into confessing to murders he did not commit by Chicago police. There's a long history of police torture resulting in coerced confessions in Chicago. And you know, there were people there in court who I knew as activists. And, you know, at one point, I mean, we're observing this case, like sitting behind the mother of this man, Gerald Reed. And at some point, you know, when I attended multiple of his hearings with different artists, and I started sometimes scheduling the residencies around his hearings because I thought it was important to try to continue to pay attention to what was happening. And at some point, I gave, you know, copies of, when I started making the publications that included those hearings and our discussion of them, I gave them to a person who knew was connected to his family, and eventually Gerald Reed was actually cleared and released from prison, and it was quite a surprise and quite enjoyable one day to receive this Facebook friend request from this person whose hearings I'd been attending. I haven't really been in touch with him since, but I mean, you know, so I think like I allow for that possibility. Did I go out of my way to like send copies of the booklets to the judges whose courts I observed? No. Like, did I seek out you know, prosecuting attorneys who I found really horrifying? Like, no, I did not do that. One like funny anecdote is that there's a bookstore in the Chicago Cultural Center that carries my publications, and through like their Shopify system, if someone pays with a credit card, as a vendor, I can sometimes actually see like who purchased what. And there was someone with the last name Topinka, and I'm like, who? That name is really familiar. And it's like the son of the former Illinois comptroller, the late Judy Bar Topinka, and her son is like a former military lawyer, you know, who had purchased like 3 copies, different issues of this publication series. So you know, like there are known and also unknown ways that these things go out into the world, and who reads them. Do I know what he thought of them? Like, no, I don't. But I always allow for that possibility that, you know, these things are you know, that they're available to all kinds of audiences. So
Yeah, I similarly wish I had more stories than I do, I think, on this question. Like, it's part of the vexatious part of print, right? Like you never get to know what your reader thinks. And you can only sort of like roughly intuit where some of these things land. For me, much less excitingly, it tends to be classrooms. Like, I will hear from professors who are like, I'm assigning a project based on this scene. I want my students to do something like it. Or like, you know, this was a format that like I could bring into a first year class, so I'm doing it. And I kind of like that, because it's for me, at least as a reader myself, like whenever I really like something, I want to pass it on to someone. So I'm like, if that's happening, then that's probably a good sign.
yeah, I mean, it was totally not a reason to bring certain. I mean, people would participate in my project by just reaching out to me through my website, and asking if they could be a resident, and then we would try to schedule and figure it out. But there were multiple, and most of the people were based in Chicago for that. But also multiple of those people teach and would bring me back to talk about the project to their students. and for us to talk about our experience together for their students. And a lot of the students are very interested in, they're abolitionists or they're interested in prison issues, and didn't even realize like that this is something you could do, that you can just go to court and sit there and walk around and observe different things, and this is or like the mechanics of how you would do that. So that was another aspect of this also, right? That it's like a methodology that has all kinds of applications. So.
Okay, we've got another question from Oro. Zines and artist books are largely para-academic in anthropology. We've been working on peer review opportunities, which bring self-publishing into academic legibility. Any thoughts on having reviewers or peer reviewers participate in publishing?
Yeah, to me, this gets to the question of like how we can be strategic in getting away with things, which is maybe to put a slightly devious spin on the question. I don't want to presume that you might sit with that mild bit of bad faith that I am. But yeah, I think certainly in Canadian academia, and to lesser degrees or more but greater degrees, depending on different contexts, right? Like there are doors that are opening around ideas like research creation or arts-based research. And quite often, those are open doors with poorly defined or highly variable interpretations on like what counts as research. So, if I put on an art exhibition somewhere, there is the kind of like legitimating factor of the name of the gallery or whether it was a juried show or not that kind of makes it more legible on my tenure file. And I sit with some uneasy enjoyment of the fact that the folks who are evaluating the tenure file probably aren't going to be artists and aren't going to have are going to sort of take it on credit that like it should count. So there's flex there where a person can drive many projects through that window. And so so I often count my zines as research creation, although like they are more than just that or aren't always that. But it is a kind of like rough label to call something to make a claim that lands with a certain audience. But I also, in my hat as a publisher, don't want to presume that that's always going to be enough for folks. So for DOI Methods, we are a juried conference. So we vet pitches and then select the ones that we think are best to move forward. And that means that folks who do get in get to say they were part of, in effect, a juried show. So it should count as something to that end. I know there are other exciting directions with folks doing things like peer reviewing like video essays and then having like the peer reviews published with the essays as a way to sort of ensure that you have good reviews and then are also sort of crediting that reviewer as in effect a tacit secondary sort of co-author of the process. I think how we do this with like highly visual design-based practices will be as varied and multiple as there are people doing it. There's lots of good ideas bubbling up through the cracks. So I'm super excited to know how that's working all out on your side, and super curious too about Mark.
I do teach college graduate level courses, but I have like zero interest in how institutions validate projects, and I really for me there's not really any hierarchy of importance between something like working in a museum or presenting work in a museum versus presenting work in someone's backyard, or a book being in like the Library of Congress versus a book being in like a little free library in my neighborhood. So yeah, I don't care about how peer review works. I think I think that like the life of the work and how it's whether it's useful or interesting, and sustains worthwhile conversations for people who read the work and tend to it. To me, I mean, that's the kind of thing that's important. You know, within, whether that's within my own field or within academia, or you know, that like the family of Gerald Reed, like that his case was discussed by people who cared enough to spend multiple mornings watching it happen, you know. So yeah. So
Maybe I can sort of build on that a little bit, because I'm kind of curious. I mean, I've been traumatized by the academic publishing system, but I've also had like amazing moments where I've seen my work develop through peer review, right? And just to be, clear, I think, peer review certainly can be mysterious, but it's also like at base another set of eyes looking at your work and saying, hey, this is working well, this doesn't really seem to work well. And when it's at its best, it is like a really congenial and rich process, I think, that leads to better work. And so I think in the spirit of that question, in some ways, the another way of asking that could also be, what does it mean to get other eyes on your work before you say, okay, I'm done, I want to put it out there, right? At what times do you say, you know what, I'm happy with, I trust myself to get this out? And at other times, maybe you're like, oh, actually, someone needs to look at this, or is this the right typeface, or am I doing things right here? I don't know. So I mean, to me, there's like another element of that too. That's not just about that big boogeyman of the corporate publishing industry and academic legitimations.
I mean, this is the thing I love about collaboration, is that like that it does provide that multiple people have a concern with what is produced, and so that another person is looking at the introduction that I write to the work we did together, and is copy editing with me and suggesting a word change, because it's like they're invested in this also. But for something like these residency reports, I don't submit them to, like, I mean, I have a amazing community of other artists who care about similar issues, but I feel good enough about the thoughtfulness of the people I've collaborated with on each discussion that that's enough for me. I'm also impatient. Like I want the work to go out into the world and not, be slogging through, fielding. I mean, it's I maybe approach it more like, it's like, if you were a painter, would you have like 15 other painters come look at your painting before you decide to show it? I mean, probably not, or would you let like, a room full of musicians listen to your album or your mixtape or whatever, before you put it on the internet? Like, I don't know, maybe people do that. Maybe if it's like a really expensive project, it needs to be like vetted by all of the backers and everything else. But I just don't feel the need for that for most of the things I do.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, go ahead.
there-
I was
well,
just
sorry, I'm muting.
okay, we'll come back to you, because I'm sure this is an interesting thought. I was just going to sort of say that, like, the kind of like history of zine making is a history of the pleasures and possibilities of not having any form of review to be accountable. Even your peers, right? You can be a stubbornly bad, cantankerous zine maker and find joy in that. And sort of when I look at my own practice, I think a lot about, as Mark mentioned, right? Like different stuff has different immediacy and need, it seems. And so some things I feel very confident just sort of throwing out and seeing what happens, others less so. Although I'm reflecting on, it sounds kind of nice what you were laying out there, Craig, to have a kind of like art school crit, right? Like available at the level of both concept and design. And it's something that I would really struggle to pull together. When I do seek out feedback from peers, I usually just circulate a kind of plain text version, because I'm looking for them to engage with like the facticity of the idea or the strength of the claim. And then I can sort of like, just trust myself to like do the visual parts on top of that. But wouldn't it be nice if it were otherwise? Maybe that's part of the magic that Compact can make happen.
Yeah, listening to you talk, Mark, it strikes me of like the feeling that I get when I co-teach with faculty from fine art, where we have like totally different starting positions, right? And like mine is like maybe like a more anxious, traditional, like let's make sure let's work through this, let's like work through it to death, and they are more typically more focused on the experience of making the work, of being together, and then the possible impact that they can't control once it's out in the world, right? And it makes me think if like this type of work or this type of practice, right? So that it's not like this, not that your publications are not precious things, but I think too often with academics that are so estranged from all the intermediate processes that go into bringing work into the world, because they are not allowed access to them, they don't even imagine that they have a choice to do a layout differently or have that kind of conversation or that kind of collaboration, that there are questions that they may not even be asking. And if they worked faster, if they worked more focused on those moments rather than this thing that's going to live forever and be a complete representation of me that I won't be able to take back, or that might get wildly popular or wildly disregarded, that there is something about the timing of the kind of work that we do. And because we're part of Society for Visual Anthropology, I'm also thinking about how much of this is already accepted within documentary filmmaking, ethnographic filmmaking, because it's such a labor, material, time, resource intensive process, that there is more of that kind of crit feedback, not necessarily vetting, but you can become kind of too close to the work to be able to see it. You need to see it with fresh eyes, and that's what peer review can do, and that's what this kind of stuff can do. And it strikes me too, Mark, that like this is also a question of genre. So I mean, I'm curious, maybe for work that's not like a write-up or a report, or not the quarantine project that was about a kind of like daily practice, have you had other kinds of relations to your work that's maybe wanting to get more feedback, if genre is the difference?
I mean, definitely with things that are on, I mean, they're different, like part of, with like making small publications is that they just don't need as much time as a full length book, right? So if you're about to print 2,000 copies of a 200-page book, like that gives you a certain amount of pause, as much as I don't want to like to think of one opportunity as more important than another, I was included, Public Lectures was included in the 2014 Whitney Biennial, which about 125,000 people attend. And I wrote a essay publication to accompany the project I showed that was about like a very complicated, sensitive situation involving this archivist who music archivist who ultimately immolated himself publicly in protest of the Iraq War. That was a text that more than one other person read. I think about 15 people probably read that. Not an academic peer review of like what I think of as just like, it was reviewed by peers, like other artists, family of his, like the people that I thought, a handful of people that I thought really that I needed to feel comfortable, with this text before but also because I was telling the story of another person, and wanted to make sure that I did that in a very careful way. Not that like other things don't require just as much care, but but there are degrees of that, I guess. So I think but I think also I'm very self-conscious about not like overly tasking my friends with like extra work, because these aren't like projects that like are put before a committee. I mean, I do get some institutional support for the work I do, but it doesn't involve, but that's more like this part-time faculty development grant that I can get from the college that I work in, or the support of talking to people's classes. And that's usually after the fact, not like having students give me feedback on, what I'm about to make or something like that.
I just want to circle back to something that you said, Anne, about we're already doing all of this labor. We're already doing all of this free work for the Academy. We might as well redirect that energy towards things that bring us pleasure, things that can circulate it in a different way. And something that you said, Mark, earlier about the print run of certain academic journals being, kind of smaller than some of these booklets and some of these publications. So I just want to, Craig, if you want to speak to this, feel free, but like, what are the alternatives that we should be pursuing or thinking about?
One answer is to be a little bit selfish and find creative ways to exist in the institutions that you exist in that are sustaining to you in ways that will be as individual as all the individuals in the room. Another and to me quite motivating ethos is to try and build coalitions. So wherever we are building little gardens, I think it's important to make sure that they connect different corridors and different parts of ourselves. So again, to sort of come back to my endless climate change is an important thing kind of theme, right? I think the viability of some of the really, really big things that we want to win will really depend on building a lot of friendships, right? And getting people from very, very dissimilar backgrounds to sort of see shared stakes in the success of it. And that for me sort of motivates how I negotiate these questions and helps also the pleasure part helps sustain the coalition part too. So wherever one can find a 2-for-1, it's always a good deal.
I mean, these friendships and community and sustaining these relationships. I mean, it's something like the zine world does incredibly well, across great distances. And part of that I think is having these tangible things that you exchange with other people. I still have hundreds of publications made by other people from when I was a teenage zine publisher in the late 80s, and would just always be getting these things in the mail constantly. Maybe one final anecdote that I think people should really it's important, I think, not to underestimate the power and impact of printed things. I was on a panel, a Zoom discussion hosted by Printed Matter about sustainable publishing models. And because I had 10 minutes to talk and had a lot I wanted to try to cram in and wanted to be respectful of time, I wrote out what I wanted to say, which I don't usually do. And afterwards, someone was like, you should publish that. That was really helpful. And I'm like, okay, because I actually wrote it out, I can easily do that. And I printed it, and people are like, I really want to have a copy of that. I want to be able to give that to my students. And then I wound up printing 1,000 copies. And then someone wanted to print, and here's one of them, right? And then someone wanted to translate into Spanish for Mexico. And I'm like, okay, let's do that. And then someone wanted to translate into Spanish for Spain, and then also for Argentina, which were a little different. And then someone translated into French, and then they translated into Korean, and then it was translated into Greek. There's another one coming up. I'm trying to remember. Portuguese, I think, is next. And you have no idea that things can move around and be and have that kind of life. If you can find this text on halfletterpress.com, the listing for the printed version just includes the entire text. So I think this idea that I think these things can have all kinds of lives in the world, and I think a lot of academic journals don't really allow you the freedom of thought to consider what all those possibilities are because of the restrictiveness on access, cost, things like that. The thing that this text that's had such a great life, I mean, the last time I printed it, it was like maybe $400 to print 2,500 copies of this thing on really nice paper because I let my printer pick out like all the papers that were left over from expensive corporate jobs that he just had. So I didn't care about all the paper being the same for every single copy. So instead it's on like 7 different beautiful papers instead of one generic paper, because I also care about book waste and publishing waste and trying to mitigate that. So it's a way for him to burn through all this stuff that was sitting around that he didn't have a use for otherwise.
It's a great anecdote. I love it.
So Craig,
Stephanie,
any last thoughts? We've got about 2 minutes.
I have a big thought, but we don't have time for that. But maybe I can just sort of throw it out there. And it's, I see the postal system, and I've been thinking a lot about it recently. And I see it a lot as something akin to public transportation, and have great concerns with the ways it's I don't know what its future might look like. And I love working between print and digital. And so I guess that's one thing I'd love to sort of finish off thinking about is futures of distribution. And you've both given some great models of walking around town and leaving them in little public libraries or on the side of the street or whatever, and handing them to other folks. But the postal system's still out there, even if it's limping along, maybe.
It's still astonishingly effective. I mean, very, very few things get lost for me. But yeah, during lockdown, when I was publishing this double-sided piece of paper, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, yeah, I would walk around and tape those to phone poles, and metal dumpsters were like a great surface to tape things to, and I would just tape the front and back. And it was such a quiet time in the city, so few people were out, that when they were, I think there was this kind of this more receptive space to reading something posted in public that maybe would be less successful now, that everything is kind of like humming along. But yeah, I mean, all of the, it was hyper local. I didn't try to like paste things up all over the city. It was either very local in my neighborhood or it was through the mail. And now, there are libraries like even like MoMA that have a complete set of every issue because they valued it. But yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of distribution channels that can be highly effective. I never have any interest in the content of religious tracts, but their design and efficiency. I mean, it's the smallest, cheapest thing you could possibly print that is like a complete self-contained text and piece of design. Yeah, they're genius, like, for these things that are left on buses. And yeah, how you sort of find people and kind of cut through the space that normally, is only reserved for commercial advertising, with sharing things, in this public guerrilla fashion. But also, I mean, that, there are all of these, classrooms, school libraries, student lounge, inspirational libraries, all kinds of things.
I'll briefly add to that. For me, like, accessibility is a really important kind of question to bring into this too. And the way that always resolves for me is to say that, like, universal design is a great idea, but is never actualized. And so I don't have the goal of making something that absolutely everyone can experience. I think it's more important to consider who my audience is and then make a couple different versions that can be seen by, a couple different kinds of people. And so having a print version and a digital version is a kind of easy way to be prompted to do that. And they will circulate in different ways and do different things. And my cat has just got here and is bumping my mic, which is maybe a great sign that I should stop speaking.
Well, I want to thank everybody that's here, both of our panelists and Craig, the SVA, the Taft Research Center, the Department of Anthropology, and my collaborators in Compact. Thank you all. And please be on the lookout. This will be posted in November along with our curated resources. Please send us a pitch. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.